The morning sun was bright in the clear blue sky, like a shining omen of a good day to come, following the aftermath of the rainstorm from the previous night. Birds were chirping, the wet grass was still glistening in the sunlight, and all seemed well with the world for Kip Dalton as he rode along the trail east of Thimble Creek. He was feeling good today. He had had a good night's sleep at a hotel at Hunter's Corners the night before. A welcome change from nights on the trail. It had also helped that he had been lucky at the faro tables earlier that night, too. He was a tall man and sat proudly and erect in the saddle. He had broad shoulders, barrel chest, and strong arms. He wore a fringed buckskin frontier jacket open all the way down, revealing the light blue breastplate shirt he wore beneath it. He wore blue cavalry pants with inch-and-a-half yellow stripes running the length of the legs, which indicated officer status. They fitted tight against his muscular legs and poured into the tops of shiny, black, calf-high military boots. A serviceable gun belt circled his middle, and a holster and pistol rode comfortably high on his right thigh without benefit of a tie-down. Kip Dalton was obviously not a man wanting to be mistaken for a gunslinger. In fact, except for seemingly having been an ex-military man, everything about him proclaimed him to be a gentleman. A freshly cleaned gray campaign hat sat atop his head, of raven black wavy hair that matched the neatly trimmed full mustache beneath a broad, strong nose and above a firm, confident mouth. He sat astride a magnificent black stallion that stood, probably 18 hands high. The horse was coal black with a black tail and mane or any markings whatsoever. His name was Saber, and Kit Dalton had claimed him from an Indian raid many years ago as the lone survivor of a settler's ranch that went up in smoke and all stock had been run off. Saber was too ornery to let himself be taken by the raiders. When Kip left the cavalry, he took Saber with him, and they had been traveling together ever since. The calmness of the early morning soon came to an end. Off to the right, over on the other side of a range of hills, gunfire had broken the stillness of the morning air. Kip pulled Saber up to a sudden halt, standing in the stirrups and craning his neck in the direction of the distant hills, as if he could see something, which of course, he couldn't. It was just a reflex reaction. At first, the shooting was only a shot or two. Then it was a barrage of fire. The barrage became more heated, and the shots sounded like they were coming from two different directions. Then they sounded like they were moving, and the firing seemed to roll into one massive echo of thunder. "Sounds like a mess of trouble over there, Saber, old boy," Kip said, scratching Saber behind the ears. The stallion shook his head gently. "Good thing we're on this side of the hills," Kip mused, as if trying to talk himself into something. "Then again, maybe we ought to take a look-see to what's going on. Probably wouldn't hurt none, as long as we don't get mixed up in it." He continued to scratch behind Saber's ear. Saber shook his head again and whinnied. "Don't laugh at me, you old bag of bones," Kip said. "You just wait and see. We're not mixing in. We're just looking." Saber shook his head and whinnied again. Kip angled the big stallion off to the right and galloped up to the ridge. He reined up sharply, just as he barely topped the rise before he would silhouette himself against the sky, but just enough to peer over into the valley below. From here, he could see two groups of riders in the valley. Both groups were farther up the valley and still approaching where Kip was watching from his vantage point. But at the speed they were traveling, they would soon be passing by in just a few more moments. The first group of riders was almost close enough to pass by already. At least they were close enough for Kip to get a fairly good look at them. There were 5 of them. 3 old men, a girl, and a boy. They were urging their horses forward at top speed, and apparently had been doing so for quite some time, for their mounts were heavily lathered and were showing signs of faltering. The riders were firing their weapons repeatedly at the onslaught of riders behind them. There were about a dozen riders rapidly closing the distance behind them. Their weapons thundered and flamed, pouring a hail of lead after their fleeing quarry. "I wonder what that's all about," Kip mused, to no one in particular, unless it was to himself or to his horse. Saber just shook his head. Well, we're not messing into that fray, if that's what you're thinking, old horse. Kip jerked the reins, pulling Saber's head up with a jerk. No, sir, not us. It was just about then that the first group of riders passed by. He noticed Kitty's auburn hair streaming out from under her Stetson. Well now, he said. Saber whinnied. Kip ignored him and glanced farther down the valley. He noticed how it was narrowing and was filling in with trees and large boulders. He wondered if the valley was pinching off into a dead end. If so, these riders must have known the territory, for they were slowing their mounts and riding into cover and starting to dismount. By now, the pursuers were almost in front of Kip Dalton. They were still riding at full speed and firing rapidly. I hate taking sides when I don't know which side is right and which side is wrong, Kip said. But it seems to me, a whole bunch of mean-looking guys after old men, a boy and a girl, just can't be fair. He pulled his Winchester from the saddle boot beneath the fender and his right knee. He spurred Saber to the top of the hill. He was in full view now of the riders below him. They were too intent on their quarry that had now dismounted, taken up refuge behind several boulders and still returning fire, that they did not see him until several of their lead riders spilled from their saddles. Kip still held the reins in his hands as he lifted the Winchester to his shoulder. As the first of the pursuing riders came abreast of him, he fired. A rider dropped from the saddle. He levered round after round into the chamber and fired as fast as he could, emptying as many saddles as he could as fast as possible. In the meantime, the Wildcat gang was continuing to pour return fire into the rest of the bunch. Horses were thrashing about. Several fell to the ground with their fallen riders. Then, as the initial surprise and shock of the unexpected attack from above wore off, some of the attention turned to the new menace coming from the ridge above. Kip remained firing, but unable to take good aim as he turned his big stallion and retreated to the far side of the ridge where he dismounted, crawled back, and resumed his attack from a prone position on the ground. He only had to fire a few more rounds, for by now the casualties below were already heavy and the attackers were ready for retreat, retrieving their wounded and making haste to evacuate the area. Knowing the battle was over, Kip slipped back over the ridge, put his rifle away, mounted Saber, and rode back to the top of the hill where he was, once again, fully skylined. He sat there for a moment, both hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. He watched as Kitty and her gang emerged from the cover of the boulders. She waved to him in thanks. He stood in the stirrups, removed his hat, and smiled broadly. The morning breeze ruffled his wavy black hair. He pulled firmly on the reins and hauled Saber to his hind legs, forelegs pawing proudly at empty air before him. Kip Dalton gallantly waved his broad-brimmed campaign hat in the air, high above his head in wide circles. "Oh, Grandpa," Kitty gasped, staring up at the sight before her. "Isn't he just beautiful?" "I hope to Lord you're talking about the horse, girl," Cyclone muttered. "Oh, no, Grandpa. I mean the man. Isn't he the most gorgeous man you ever did see?" "Oh, no, not another one." Cyclone groaned under his breath. Kip brought Saber down on all fours, and in one swift motion, the big black stallion knelt on one knee in a final bow. Kip flourished his hat once more, set it smartly on his head, drew Saber to all fours, spun him around, and rode off with Saber's tail swishing to and fro with flair. "Ooh," Kitty swooned, eyes fluttering. "Lawdy, Lawdy," Arapaho Brown sighed. He pulled out a flask and took a swig. "If I was a drinking man, Rap," Jeremy said, "I'd join you." "Not from my bottle you wouldn't," Rap said. He took another snort. Chapter 7. Kip Dalton urged Saber across the railroad tracks. The big black gingerly stepped carefully between the railroad ties. A waiting train, puffing smoke from its stack, sat idly in front of the rail station a few hundred feet away. People were disembarking, and new travelers stood on the board platform of the station waiting to board. There was hustle and bustle further down the line as workers hurried to unload freight from cars and reload them with awaiting goods. The railroad had been a recent addition to Thimble Creek, with a spur from the main rail line having been completed only months earlier. With anticipation that the railroad's arrival would bring new growth to Thimble Creek, the new rail was placed a quarter-mile to the north of town. It was expected that the newly named town of Fortune City would sprawl at least as far as the railroad station, and probably beyond. In the meantime, travelers would have to shuttle the quarter-mile distance from the outskirts of town to the station. Because of its name, Kip Dalton would have expected Thimble Creek to have been a much smaller town, but he was already aware that it was a growing community and had already been petitioned to change its name to Fortune City as a reflection of its city's main citizen and benefactor, Simon Price. As Kip rode into the main street of Thimble Creek near noontime, he noted the banners that had been strung across the street, high above his head, proclaiming the upcoming celebration and festivities that would usher in the newly changed name of Thimble Creek to Fortune City. Governor Stanton himself would be on hand. The town was alive with the hustle and bustle of merchants and businessmen going about their daily routines and duties. Townspeople and shoppers wee busy going about their necessary business. It wasn't often that a man like Kip Dalton came riding into town. A tall, handsome man on a magnificent steed was enough to draw a lot of attention, but a man like Kip Dalton and a gallant stallion like Saber was enough to stop all activity, turn every head, and draw all attention. Kip was used to the attention. He normally expected it. It followed him everywhere. He would have felt it unusual if people were not staring at him, so he did not realize there were some on the street who were staring at him for reasons other than his good looks. The well-dressed, two-gun man, standing in front of the sheriff's office, was a strapping, fine figure of a man with broad shoulders and lean hips. Black curly hair peeked out below his broad-brimmed black hat with a silver concho hatband. His rugged face was clean-shaven. He had a strong chin, razor-blade nose, and dark, piercing black eyes. His name was Peso Martin, and was head segundo on Simon Price's enormous ranch, as well as his chief gunfighter and right-hand man in all of Price's dirty dealings. He stepped off the wooden sidewalk as Kip Dalton rode by, and followed along at a distance behind him in the dusty street. As Kip angled the big black stallion slowly to and fro amid the traffic of wagons and horses and riders, he noted the numerous establishments bearing the name of Simon Price as owner, partner, trustee, or landlord. The bank proclaimed him president, the courthouse proclaimed him judge and mayor. Simon Price was just about everything Kip Dalton already knew about him, maybe even more. Midway along the main street, the street widened, creating room for a town square or gathering place. On the right side of the square was the town hall and courthouse. To the left side was an ornate three-floor hotel. The second floor of the building had obviously been added on, as a section of roofing still protruded beneath the windows of second floor. Beyond the town square, the street once again narrowed to a normal width street. Kip spotted the hotel. Noting that it also housed a restaurant, he reminded himself that it had been a while since breakfast, and he had had a long ride and a busy morning. He reflected on the early morning skirmish and the young girl with the streaming auburn hair. He smiled to himself and wondered once again what that had all been about. He reined Saber off to the opposite side of the street from the hotel, and a ways further down from the square, having noticed that there were no hitch rails in front of the hotel. The frontage had been left open for carriages to drop off and pick up guests. Kip tied up the stallion, walked down and across the street, and entered the lobby of the hotel. It was quite elegant for a western town, and the lobby was furnished with fine furniture. Off to the left The hotel manager was attending to guests at the desk. Immediately to the left of the desk was a stairway that led to the upstairs, and farther to the left was the attached restaurant. Kip could hear the tinkling of glass and the scrape of silverware, along with the buzz of conversation in the dining room. He was heading straight for the restaurant when a blonde-haired lady appeared on the stairway to his left. She wasted no time in making her presence known. Kip turned suddenly to glance up the stairway. The lady was making her way down quickly, but in a way that made it look like she was in no hurry. "Well, hello there, tall, dark, and handsome," Flo Baxter said. Her voice was low and sultry, and she had no shame when it came to being forward. Actually, she had no shame at all. After all, she didn't have time to wait for the niceties or proprieties that took time. Time for her was running out. Years and 3 husbands had slipped away. She had to resort to heavy makeup these days. She amply filled out her tight, clinging, low-cut blouse, and extra poundage around her waist tugged at the fabric of her skirt. "You're new in town," she said, stating it as a fact rather than a question. "That I am indeed, ma'am," Kip answered, smiling broadly. His cheeks had a way of puffing into large bubbles beneath his sparkling gray eyes. He swept his hat off in a broad gesture and bowed gallantly. A lock of his raven black hair fell into a comma onto his forehead. "Kiplinger R. Dalton, at your service. And yes, I just rode into town." Flo's forward approach had not put him off one bit. "I'm Flo Baxter." Flo reached out her hand as she stepped off the last step of the staircase. Kip took it graciously in both hands and caressed it. "Miss Flo Baxter," she reiterated, making sure he got the message. "I live here in the hotel," Flo announced as a follow-up. "Might as well get right to the point. Are you going to be staying here too?" "Well, probably not here at the hotel, but I am buying some land around here, so I expect I'll be in the area for quite some time." "Oh, that will be so nice," Flo gushed. She put another hand on top of Kip's and wasn't letting him let her go. "Perhaps we'll be seeing more of each other then." "I certainly hope so," Kip said. "I was just on my way to get some lunch," Kip added, sensing Flo's tug on his hand meant she wasn't about to let him go. "Would you care to join me, Miss Baxter?" "Oh, I'd just love to," Flo said, releasing his hand and taking his arm. "Just call me Flo, Kiplinger, you said?" "Kip, just call me Kip." Kip and Flo had been seated at a small round table in the middle of the dining room. Since this was the height of the lunch period, business was fairly brisk, and the room was nearly 2/3 full. They had barely given their orders to the waitress and relinquished their menus when 3 men burst into the dining room. One was a lean man wearing a silver star on his vest, Deputy Sims. The others were Peso Martin and another rough-looking man who also wore 2 guns in gunner fashion. Peso Martin had the swagger of a man on a mission. He knew the man he was after was in there. He had seen his big black stallion tethered outside, and he had seen the man entering the hotel. He had talked with the desk clerk and checked the register and knew the man had not checked in, so he had to be in the restaurant. He no sooner entered the dining area when he spotted the man he was after. Peso was already an angry man, but now his anger rose to new heights when he saw that this man was with Flo Baxter. She was supposed to be Peso's girl, even if Simon Price thought she was his girl. The truth was, she was everybody's and nobody's girl, but he would always believe just what he wanted to believe and just what she wanted him to believe. Peso motioned to Sims and the other man and strode deliberately across the room towards Kip's table. The other 2 followed close behind. Without breaking stride, Peso stepped close behind Kip's chair, twisted his body to stand directly behind him. Kip's attention was on the conversation with Flo and didn't notice the movement behind him. Flo did notice, though, but knowing Peso the way she did, and just being Flo Baxter, she knew better than to give anything away. Her eyes never wavered, and Kip never saw it coming. With one swift motion, Peso Martin reached down, under, and around Kip Dalton, plucking his pistol quickly from its holster. He tossed it to the floor, and in a following split second, he had used both hands to grasp Kip by the back of his collar and pull him to his feet. "He's the one, all right, Sims," Peso said as he shoved Kip into the deputy's arms. Sims had his Colt out and pointed at Kip as he held him at bay. By now, the whole dining room was in an uproar. Diners were excited and jumping up from their tables. "Nothing to get excited about, folks," Sims said, lifting his voice to be heard above the din. "We'll get this fellow out of here, and you can get back to your lunch. You'll probably hear all about it later on. For now, it's nothing to concern yourselves over." "Well, I think this is something to concern myself over," Kip said. "Mind telling me what this is all about?" "You know what it's all about," Peso Martin scoffed. "If I did, I wouldn't be asking. You saying you never saw me before? Well, if I have, I guess you weren't that memorable. Look, you may be good looking, and I may be too. I don't know which way you swing, but I sure don't." Peso balled his fist and took a step forward. "Hold it, Peso," Sims said. "Let it go. He's just trying to rile you." Then to Kip, Sims said, "You denying that you shot at this man and his posse this morning?" "I shot at a bunch of men this morning, sure. If this man was with them, I didn't distinguish him from any of the rest. As for shooting at a posse, I didn't see any badges. All I saw was a lot of hard cases chasing some old men, a boy and a girl. It looked like a mighty unfair situation to me, so I took a hand in it." "Unfair?" Peso Martin shouted. "I'll tell you what was unfair. You just helped the most vicious outlaw gang in the entire Southwest to escape. That's what you did." "Vicious?" Kip laughed. "You must be joking. Now I know you're a pansy." Peso could no longer contain himself. He stepped forward, pulled Kip around, away from Sims, and planted his fist squarely in the middle of Kip's face, squashing his nose, drawing blood, and forcing Kip's head and shoulders sharply backwards. His toes lifted off the floor, and he rocked backward on his heels, smashing into Sims and driving the lean deputy's body back and sideways out of the way. The blow had come so suddenly and with such surprise and shock that Kip was completely taken off balance. He was still skittering backwards on his heels, his arms splayed outwards and drooping downwards as Peso stepped in close, burying his fist into Kip's midsection. Kip doubled over, letting out a whoosh of air. A dull glaze washed over his eyes, and his arms instinctively recoiled to cover his aching stomach. But just in time to feel Peso's knee slam up under his chin with a driving force that straightened his body to full height, and he stumbled backward, pushing a table aside and slamming his back flat against the restaurant wall. The shock of the impact was enough to clear his vision for only a moment, but just enough to see Peso charging at him once more, head down, body bent, face twisted into a nasty snarl. At just the right moment, Sedilla Kip slid aside, grasping Peso by the back of his collar and his gun belt, and slammed the man head first into the wall. Martin bounced back dazedly, Kip still retaining his grasp. He pulled Peso's body back a few more inches and rammed his head into the wall again. Then, huffing and puffing, trying to stay on his own feet, Kip hauled the dazed Peso Martin to an almost standing position. Peso's legs were useless, and he couldn't put his feet down. Blood dripped down the side of his face, and his tongue lolled out the side of his mouth. Kip tried hard to hold the man up with one hand while he balled his fist and cocked his elbow to give him one last finishing blow. But he was unsteady on his feet, and his strength was waning. With one big sigh of defeat, he released Peso and let him drop to the floor. He let his arms droop before him and wheezed resolutely between gasping breaths. "All right, Sedilla deputy. Do what you want with me. I won't give you any trouble." "No, I don't think you will," Sims said with a wry grin. Then to the third man that had come in with him, Sims said, indicating Peso Martin. Billings, get him out of here and get him fixed up before we have to explain this. Is there a lawyer in this town? Kip Dalton asked, as Sims ushered him inside the cell at the rear of the sheriff's office. The deputy pulled the door shut and turned the key. Sure, he said. Andrew Warden. He's town council. Public defender, prosecutor, and Simon Price's legal advisor. Great, Kip scoffed. Is there anything else he is? He wouldn't happen to be judge, jury, and executioner too, would he? Sims grinned, noting the sarcasm. Well, now that you mention it, he ain't the judge. His grin spread wider and his eyes sparkled. Mr. Price happens to hold that title all by himself. But Warden is about to become the judge's son-in-law right soon. That's just great. And I suppose there's no other lawyer in this town I could hire? Nope. Maybe I could send a wire and bring someone in. Now, just how are you going to do that? Sims chided. It costs money to send telegrams and hire lawyers, and last time I looked, you ain't got none. What are you talking about? Kip said, reaching for his inside pocket and pulling out his wallet. He noticed immediately how flat it felt. He didn't have to look inside it to know it was empty. Hey, what's going on here? He growled. What did you do with my money? You did a lot of damage to the restaurant and hotel, mister. We had to pay off what you owed. I can't help it if there was nothing left. You should have behaved yourself. Why do I get the feeling it wouldn't have made any difference? Kip said. It wasn't a question. Sims just laughed. So, I guess, in other words, my goose is cooked. Is that right? Right down to the giblets, Sims chuckled, bobbing his head up and down gleefully. And I suppose I'm charged with helping desperate criminals evade the law. Is that it? That and disturbing the peace. Damage to private property, assaulting officers of the law, vagrancy, and no visible means of support. I guess that just about covers it. I guess that's enough to put you away for a long time working hard labor in Mr. Price's silver mine. That's where we usually send fellas like you. You look like a strong man. I reckon you can handle a pick and shovel right well. Somehow, Mr. Deputy, Kip said with a forceful tone, I think you're going to find out that you've made one big mistake here. He hadn't wanted to reveal the real purpose for his presence in Thimble Creek, but the situation was getting entirely out of hand. I demand to see Simon Price at once, Kip ordered. Oh, the big man demands to see Simon Price, Sims mocked. I'm sure he'll want to come running right over to see what you want. Maybe he'll bring you a lollipop. Now why, Don? Till you just sit down and shut up. With a flourish, he jingled his keys triumphantly, turned and his heel, and strode out of the cell area back to the office. He whistled Yankee Doodle as he went. What did you say the prisoner's name was? Sheriff Harvey Trask demanded, of his deputy. It was mid-afternoon when the sheriff returned from delivering his prisoners. He had caught Sims in his usual position, sleeping in the sheriff's chair with his feet up on the desk. Trask had caught his deputy like this many times before, and it always irritated him. He deliberately slammed the door behind him, making as much noise as possible. Sims jerked awake with a start. His eyes were barely open, but open enough to catch a glimpse of the stout sheriff tossing his hat on a hook next to the door and striding across the floor. Sims was still trying to scramble out of the chair as Trask purchased a hold on his shoulder and hauled him completely out of it. Sims stumbled across the floor, regaining full consciousness by the time he managed to stand erect. Trask demanded a report of any happenings during his absence, and Sims lost no time in relaying the harrowing experience of the night before when he had been visited by the Wildcat gang. Trask was visibly upset by the news that Wildcat Kitty and the Cyclone Kid were back in the territory. He was now more relieved than ever that Simon Price had agreed to remove the 4 young boys from the Thimble Creek jail to another area altogether, even though he feared that when the Wildcats found out what they had done with the boys, there might be hell to pay. As the thought of new dangers crowded his mind, he did not listen closely to the more mundane news of an additional prisoner in his jail. It was not until he heard something about this prisoner aiding the Wildcat gang that he finally took notice, and then something about what Sims said about the man's name got his attention. "What did you say that prisoner's name was?" Trask asked again. Dolan Dawson, something like that," Sims said. He wrinkled his brow and squinted. "No, I remember now. It's Dalton. Kiplinger Dalton." Trask grimaced. "Not Major Kiplinger Remington Dalton?" He fumed with exasperation. "I dunno. He is wearing soldier pants. For Chris' sakes, get him out of there and go get Simon." Chapter 8. "Think we ought to go down there and get him, Red?" Kirby asked. "We could just sneak up on him, bust in and shoot him before they knew what he meant." "No, I don't," Red said with irritation. He was lying on the ground in a mess of weeds, holding binoculars to his eyes. His elbows were propped on the ground, making a tripod for himself. He didn't bother to look away from his view to answer his brother. "I'll tell you when and what I think. In the meantime, just keep your yap shut." They had been staked out on a high ridge for several hours, watching the run-down ranch house and outbuildings in the valley below. The trees and high weeds gave them adequate cover from being seen, and at this distance, if they kept to minimum movement and silence, their presence would not likely be detected. It was getting late in the afternoon, and shadows were stretching across the valley. It wouldn't be long before the sun completely dropped below the far horizon on the opposite side of the valley and bring on approaching dusk. They had followed the Wildcat gang since early morning. They had seen the shootout with pursuit riders and had seen them helped out by a mysterious interloper. Not daring to get too close just yet, the Beatties followed the gang to this abandoned ranch in the hills. They watched as the outlaw band hid their horses in the old barn and then took refuge in the ranch house itself. There had been no further movement nor sight of the Wildcats for the rest of the day. Red had been content to wait and watch patiently. Kirby and Jonas paced and thrashed about in the weeds, continually asking Red what was going on, as Red was the only who could see anything since he had benefit of field glasses. "Will you boys settle down?" Red would say occasionally, irritated that the same question would come every few minutes. "And keep an eye on the runt," he would remind them. Willis had been sullen these past several days. As much as Red had explained to him the importance of what they were doing and the importance of being family, the boy was still angry. Red had even promised Willis that he would not hurt Kitty Carlin. Red knew the boy did not believe him. He didn't trust Red, and Red still didn't trust the boy to do his part when the time came. If he would at least not interfere and mess things up, that would be sufficient for Red. Family is family, Red thought to himself, and he knew what his ma would think about it if she were still alive, but she wasn't, and Willis was just a half-brother. Red supposed that he would only be half wrong if he had to kill Willis. But what the hell? Half wrong can't be all bad. "Hey, someone's coming," Jeremy said excitedly. He had passed by the front room window and got the movement out of the corner of his eye. He quickly stepped to the side of the window. There were no curtains. The others jumped up quickly from where they were sitting. Rapp was stoppering his bottle and stuffing it into his coat pocket. "Stay back," Jeremy ordered almost in a whisper, motioning them to stay away from the window with the palm of his hand. They fanned out and approached the window from the far sides, right and left. Kitty drew up close behind Jeremy. Cyclone, Rapp, and Chief slid up close to the window on the other side. "Looks like that fella that horned in on us this morning," Cyclone said. "How do you suppose he found us?" Kip Dalton had just reined his big black stallion into the barnyard and pulled up. He lifted himself up in the saddle and stretched a bit, looking over the ranch and surrounding structures for a moment. Then he settled back into the saddle and gigged the big horse to the right and began a slow ride around the area, giving it a good looking over. "He must have followed us," Kitty said. There was a bit of hopeful lilt to her voice. "Took the darn fool all day if he did," Cyclone scoffed. Think he's one of them bounty hunters, Si? Rap asked. If he was a bounty hunter, why did he help us out this morning? Kitty said, coming to his defense quickly. Why else would he follow us then? Jeremy asked. That's obvious, you darn fool. We got something he wants, Si snapped. What have we got, Si? Arapaho asked dimly. We got what he ain't gonna get, Cyclone said, looking at his granddaughter. Then to Kitty, he said, Girl, you get back there and stay out of sight. I'll take care of this. He drew his pistol and stepped toward the door. By now, Kip Dalton had finished his survey of the ranch grounds and had guided Saber up to the hitch rail in front of the ranch house. He was just dismounting, his left foot still in the stirrup and his right still in the air, lifted high above the saddle, when the Cyclone Kid burst through the ranch house front door, pistol in hand, a menacing look on his face. Don't bother finishing, mister. Best you just settle back into that saddle and go back where you came from. Kip froze in mid-motion. Reflex and experience had taught him to see the gun first, and the gaping barrel muzzle pointed at him. He caught his breath. Then he saw the man behind the gun. He clearly saw the danger in Cyclone's face, but he forced himself a broad smile and settled back into the saddle. He wrapped the reins around the pommel and leaned against it with both hands. In case you don't recognize me, I'm the fellow that saved your bacon this morning, Kip said. I know who you are, Cyclone said, and you can still get out of here. I got myself into considerable trouble helping you out, Kip pleaded. That still don't give you no call to follow us out here, Cyclone said. Now do I have to tell you again to get, or do I have to shoot you? I'd rather you just get, 'cause I don't much feel like digging a hole to bury you. I'm getting too old for that. Before you go making any decisions, Kip said, maybe you ought to take a look at this. With his right hand, he started to reach inside his buckskin jacket on the left side. Hold it right there, Cyclone ordered. Not another move. I just wanted to show you, sir, the deed I hold to this property. You see, I just bought it, and I must say, I am very much disappointed in what I see. But displeasing as it is, this property belongs to me, and it is you, not I, sir, who is trespassing. So if anyone is going to get, it's you. At that moment, Kitty stepped out behind her grandfather. Let him show us the paper, Grandpa, she said. Cyclone grimaced and lowered his pistol slightly. Kip smiled, pulled out the paper, and handed it over to Kitty. You bought this place from Simon Price? It was more of a statement than a question. I suppose you didn't see it before you bought it. I saw pictures, Kip said. The valley was lush and the buildings were in good shape. That was a long time ago, Kitty said. Before Price diverted the river and cut off the water supply. He sold this land twice before. Neither buyer could make a go of it, and it has gone downhill ever since. We knew the last owners. Price had them so far into debt that they finally had to walk away from it. And now he sold the property again, Kip said resolutely. Sorry, Kitty said. That's about the size of it. She handed him back the paper. Mind if I get down now, miss, Kip said. I'm getting a little tired sitting up here, and I think by now I have established this is my home, such as it is. Yes, you have, Kitty apologized. Then to Cyclone, Grandpa, she admonished, put that cannon away and let the poor man get down off his horse. Cyclone hefted his pistol, looked a bit sheepish, and put the weapon away. Poor man, my foot, he growled to himself under his breath. We'll get off your property right away, mister, Kitty said. Kip swung out of the saddle to the ground. There's no need for that, he said. At least, not right away. No harm's been done. Rap, Chief, and Jeremy stepped through the open doorway behind Kitty and Cyclone. They still looked a little apprehensive, but they had shown themselves since the situation looked friendly enough. Kip saw them over Kitty's shoulder. He smiled slightly, but a little wary. He tipped his hat and said, "How do, fellows?" Then, he removed his hat gallantly and bowed at the waist. May I introduce myself, young lady and gentlemen? I am Kiplinger Remington Dalton, formerly Major, United States Cavalry at your service. Well, dippity-doo-dah, Cyclone muttered to himself under his breath, puckering up his lips and making a face. You know who we are? Kitty asked, cautiously. I would guess, from what I've heard, you, my fair lady, are the so-called notorious Wildcat Kitty, though to me you appear to be much more of a cuddly kitten, and these other gentlemen are known as the Wildcat Gang. I would guess, he said, pointing to Jeremy, he's the legendary Cyclone Kid. He's the legendary Pipsqueak, that's what he is, Cyclone fumed. I'm the Cyclone Kid. I ain't legendary nother. I'm just old, but I'm her granddaddy, and don't you go getting no notions about her. Besides, you're way too old for her. Grandpa, Kitty implored him, behave yourself. Mr. Dalton was just being polite. We could use a little more of that around here. She looked from Cyclone to the others, and back to Cyclone. Then to Kip she said, I'm sorry about my grandfather, Mr. Dalton. He just gets a little too overprotective about me. I don't nother, Cyclone blustered. Besides, how do we know he's not one of those bounty hunters? I assure you I'm not, Kip said. I didn't even know who you were when I took sides this morning. How about we go inside and talk this out? Just who is that guy anyways? Red Beatty growled, still looking through the field glasses and talking to himself as much as to anyone. Ain't that the guy that helped them out this morning? Jonas asked, crawling up beside Red. Yeah, Red grunted. Something mighty fishy about that guy. Cyclone comes rushing out waving a gun at him. Next thing you know, that gal is coming out gushing all over him, just as sweet as you please. Then they all go inside like one big happy family. Gushing all over him? Willis jumped up suddenly, coming out of his funk. He rushed up beside his brothers and dropped down in the weeds beside them where he could get a good view of the ranch house. There was nothing for him to see. All was quiet below and no one was in sight. He heaved a sigh of disgust, ripped off a handful of weeds, and tossed them aside angrily. Not so fond of your young lady now, are you, kid? Red said with a tone of, I told you so, as he lowered the glasses and rolled to his side to look at the kid. He grinned with self-satisfaction. Maybe now you won't be so much against what we have to do. With the money we get, you can get girls 10 times better than her, now that you've seen for yourself what kind of girl she is. Don't say that, Red. Willis got up and stomped away angrily. You saw for yourself, kid, Red shouted after him. She likes big, handsome, rich-looking men. Why do you think she never gave you a tumble before? She sure won't now, with that big galoot around. Willis kept walking, pretending he didn't hear, but he did, and he knew Red was right. Kitty Carlin had only pretended to be nice to him. She probably laughed at him and thought him a fool. She would pay for that. He and his brothers would see to that. The deputy had me in jail and had threatened me that I would be sentenced to hard labor in Simon Price's silver mine. Apparently, that's where all prisoners are taken so Simon Price can have free labor, Kip Dalton said, as part of his dissertation about his visit to Thimble Creek. They had been sitting around the kitchen table, and after introductions had been made all the way around, and assurances had been made that Kip Dalton was not a bounty hunter. He was not interested in collecting bounty, as Kip Dalton was a man of means in his own right. He had recounted the meeting with Flo Baxter, the fight in the hotel restaurant, and his subsequent arrest. He told how Sims had thought he was just a passing drifter and saw an opportunity to rob him of all of his money and turn him into slave labor for Simon Price. Apparently, the sheriff had been away, and when he returned, he seemed to know that Simon Price had been expecting me. Little did I know, I was just being conned by Price anyways. He still got my money. How much did he stick you for this miserable piece of dirt? Cyclone asked. He had listened to Dalton's story with somewhat concerned interest, and he asked the question in a much more accepting manner toward the man that had taken Kitty's fancy. 14,000, Kip grimaced. Fortunately, he didn't take everything I had. but I still feel like a fool letting myself be taken like that. But then he grinned broadly. I can look at the bright side, though, he said. What's that? Kitty said. How much fun it's going to be getting my money back. Now you sound like my kind of man, Rap said. You'll likely get your purty head shot off, fella, Cyclone said. Price plays pretty rough. Oh, I don't mean he does it himself. Shucks, he's a lily-livered pansy waste, and I'll betcha he's got hisself a good case of laryngitis right about now. Cyclone smiled, showing his big yellowed teeth. How'd you know about his laryngitis? He kinda got a special lollipop stuck down his throat the other night. Kitty smiled. Played with the wrong little kitty cat, you might say. I'll bet, Kip said. But he still has his ways of being dangerous, you say? Yes, he hires gunmen to do his dirty work. There's none meaner than Peso Martin, and you've already done riled him up considerable, and I can guarantee it, he ain't gonna take it too kindly. Best you watch your back, boy. Don't worry about me, Cy, Kip said. Cyclone jerked his head up in surprise at Kip's use of familiarity with his name. Huh? He grunted, then quickly looked away, not expecting a response. Kip glanced to Kitty and smiled. She smiled back. Their gazes fixed on each other for several seconds. Their smiles softened, and their eyes bored deeply into each other's, seeking, searching. Something's been bothering me, Cyclone spoke up, breaking their moment. Their faces jerked away from each other, looked straight ahead, fixing their attention on Cyclone. There was a bit of disconcern and annoyance in their expressions. You said Sheriff Trask got back this afternoon from someplace. That's right. He was supposed to have taken some prisoners to Yuma prison yesterday afternoon. But if he had, he couldn't have gotten there and back by this afternoon. What are you getting at, Grandpa? Kitty asked. She already was way ahead of him. She had a good idea of what he was thinking. She just wanted to hear him say it. That lying weasel, Price, even with a gun stuck down his throat and death staring him in the face, he can't tell the truth. He still had to lie to us. He didn't send them boys to Yuma. He sent him to his mine for free labor. The boys? Kip asked. We'll explain in a minute, Kitty said. Then to Cyclone, but Grandpa, Price's silver mine is in Colorado. It would have taken even longer than going to Yuma. But the old codger has another mine north of his ranch. It's not that far. Maybe that's the one he's sending the prisoners to. Even for Price, he wouldn't dare to work Arizona prisoners in another state. I don't know, Grandpa. Price would dare anything. Besides that, mine hasn't been worked in years. Last I heard, it was nearly played out and wasn't worth working. But with free labor, Jeremy put in. Maybe it is worth working. I think we should check it out. The others were in quick agreement. Kitty quickly explained to Kip about Frankie the Kid and his 3 friends. Then she said, it's already well past dark and it will take several hours to get there. We'll have to travel slow in the dark, but we can be there before dawn if we get started in the next hour or two. They all started to get up from the table. Kip stood with them. Thank you, Mr. Dalton, Kitty said to him as they got up, for understanding our presence here and being so kind. We'll appreciate you not letting the law know about seeing us. We won't come back here and trouble you any further. Well, first of all, Kitty, Kip said with a beaming smile, there is no thanks necessary, and the name is Kip, not Mr. Dalton, and I would never divulge anything about you to the law, or anyone else for that matter. And most of all, I was hoping that this was not goodbye. I was hoping I could go with you. But this isn't your fight, Kitty said, and this could get you into a whole lot of trouble. Seems to me Simon Price has made a fight with me and trouble is already here. You'll be doing me a favor if you let me come along. See what I told you? Rap Brown said. He's my kind of man. Chief said, Aim, me not know you swing that way, paleface. Chapter 9. Where are they going? Red Beatty complained. The night was very dark. The sky was overcast with heavy cloud cover. Clouds had lingered all day from the storm of the night before and were once again bunching and threatening another rainstorm. Wind was picking up, and dust was beginning to swirl around the horses' legs. They had been following the Wildcats for over 2 hours, ever since they left the ranch house. It had taken a while to come down from the high country and get on their trail, so they were already quite a ways behind from the get-go. They didn't hurry after them, for fear of being noticed. They trailed along at a leisurely pace, taking care not to get too close. The encroaching darkness had enveloped them deeper and deeper into the gloom until they lost almost complete sight of their quarry. Only from time to time did they capture a glimpse of them, sky-lined on a ridge or open horizon, and sounds of horses' hooves scraping against rock, or creaking of saddle leather and chinking of bridles and trappings. They had been on the trail for over 2 hours, and the going had gotten slower and slower. Their quarry was continuing to expand their lead ahead of them. It had been over a half an hour since the Beatties had seen or heard any sign of the Wildcats. "We should have followed them closer," Kirby complained. They were riding their horses at a walk. Riding in the dark was always dangerous. A horse could step into a chuck hole without the rider or horse seeing it. At more than a walk, a horse could easily come up lame. "Shut up, you fool," Red ordered in a loud whisper. "You want anybody to hear us coming?" "They're so far ahead of us they wouldn't hear us coming with a 21 gun salute," Kirby said. "They may not be so far ahead as you think, Kirby. So can the talk." "Just the same, I think we've lost them. Might as well go back." "I think so too, Red," Jonas added. "It's starting to get cold and I think it's going to rain again tonight." "How many times I gotta tell you boys I do the thinking around here, and I'm telling you, we're pushing on whether they're close ahead or not. We keep going this way, we're bound to catch up to them sooner or later. If we don't, and I'm wrong, which I never am," he gloated, "we'll go back and wait for them at the ranch. They're bound to come back there, but I'd rather keep them in sight out here, before any of them bounty hunters get them in their sights ahead of us. You understand me now?" "Well, yeah," Kirby whined. "But why don't we just go back and get in out of the cold now?" Red shook his head in exasperation. "I just told you." He gigged his horse forward at a little faster walk. Simon Price's Silver Dollar silver mine was located on the floor of a large basin ringed with high cliff-like walls. Years of excavation had carved this basin out of what had once been high country covered with desert sand, cactus, and Joshua trees. The land had been dry and barren, totally unfit for the grazing of cattle, but Simon Price was never one to let land go to waste. Like King Midas, who turned everything to gold with his touch, Simon Price seemed to have the silver touch. He had struck silver in the high country years ago. He had mined it extensively, taking out massive amounts of ore that he used to help build his empire. In so doing, he had created the Great Basin. All that was left of the mine now was the shaft at the base of the east wall of the basin. A slight tinge of gray was just starting to appear in the sky above the east wall and above the mine entrance, announcing that morning would soon be approaching. But soon, the dark cloud mass moved farther across the sky, blotting it out. Raindrops started to fall, and darkness still remained just as if it were still the middle of the night. Even though it was still nighttime, the buildings surrounding the mine appeared to be alive with activity. There was light in the windows of all of the buildings. There was a small building that served as an office building, and another larger building that served as a makeshift refinery and smelter. Next to this building was a stamping mill. From up above on the top of the basin, a network of flumes brought water into the basin to power both facilities. Behind both of these buildings was an open lean-to type livery affair. There was room to shelter 6 horses and provide them with hay and grain. Standing parked in front of the stamping mill was what appeared to be a loaded freight wagon, for the wagon bed was covered with canvas and was somewhat off the floor of the wagon. 2 teams of horses were harnessed and hitched to the wagon, indicating a heavy load and ready to go. They were ground hitched with weighted anchors. Beyond the livery, a trail led to the north end of the basin, slanting upward and diagonally along the side, winding gradually, providing the only way in and out of the basin. Normally, an operating mine of this size might only have a couple of guards stationed at night, and only a lantern or two might be seen. But with this much light and evidence of life, it appeared that there may be several persons present on the property. Granted, with morning approaching, the mine manager might want to get an early start. That would account for the light on in the office. But, as for the rest of the area and the appearance of activity, that could be accounted for if, in fact, prisoners were being held as slaves in the mine. The loaded freight wagon being readied for movement this early was further indication that the mine was in full nighttime operation. The Wildcats were sure now that they had come to the right place to find their friends. Kitty, Jeremy, and Kip had circled around the edge of the basin to the east side. They had taken ropes with them. They would find some place to secure them on top of the basin and lower themselves down beside the mine entrance. They had chosen this side because if there was any delay in making their descent and the sun started to come up, at least they would still be in shadow. Cyclone and the others across the way would keep a lookout while they climbed down to the basin floor. The raindrops had increased in speed and intensity as Kitty, Jeremy, and Kip made their way to the east side of the basin. By the time they reached their destination, they were caught in a full-fledged downpour. Rain poured off the brims of their hats and streamed into their faces as they found places to tie off the ends of their ropes and start the descent into the basin. With one final look, checking the area below and seeing no one stirring about, and one more quick glance toward the other side of the basin to make sure that Cyclone was still giving the all clear, they went over the edge and down the side. All went well, except for the mud and the sliding, but all three of them managed to lower themselves successfully without any incident or discovery. Now that they were in, they knew they had to act fast. The ropes they had lowered themselves down on were still fastened tight at the top, and there was no way they could hide or dispose of them. The ropes would have to hang there in plain sight. If someone were to come along and see them, Kitty's, Jeremy's, and Kip's presence would be known immediately, and someone would come looking for them. They would have to hope that the darkness would hide the evidence of their entrance long enough for them to do what they had come there to do and get out. Kitty had no way of knowing whether the prisoners were billeted in one of the buildings for sleeping purposes or not, but knowing Simon Price as she did, she suspected he would keep them in the mine and work them as much as possible. She didn't think he would care much about sleeping quarters for his prisoners. The only light in the mine tunnels would be lanterns or torches. Prisoners wouldn't know whether it was night or day anyways. She opted to search the mine first. They slid along the muddy wall of the basin, keeping in darkness as much as possible, and approached the entrance to the mine. They were within a few feet of the entrance when the doorway of the office building opened up. Light flooded out into the rain. Two men emerged carrying lanterns. They were both wearing slickers and hard hats. Their heads were down, shielding themselves from the rain, and they were talking loudly so they could hear each other above the sound of the pelting rain. But, even as they came near the mine entrance, Kitty couldn't make out what they were saying. The two men came within a foot and a half of the three interlopers as they passed them by and entered the mine. Kitty and her companions held their breath and pressed their backs harder against the wall of the basin. As the two men hunched over and lifted their lanterns to enter the mine, Kitty saw their faces plain. She had all she could do to refrain from letting her breath out and gasping in surprise, but somehow she managed. One of the men she recognized was Conrad Price, Simon Price's son. Conrad didn't look much like his father. Where Simon was a bit rotund with a round bulldog-like face, Conrad was thin and spindly. He had a long, lean face, heavily pockmarked from a childhood illness. His chin bone was sharply pointed. His neck was long and thin with the pronounced Adam's apple that bobbed up and down when he spoke. His eyes were dark and droopy, reflecting the lack of intellect. Where his father, Simon, was shrewd and calculating, Conrad was just plain dumb. The last she had heard, Conrad was managing his father's silver mine in Colorado. What was he doing down here in Arizona, working this old mine? Long before Simon Price had destroyed Kitty's father and stolen their ranch, Kitty had despised Conrad Price. He was a slimy, lecherous, self-centered piece of crap, hardly worthy of being called part of the human race. But so was Simon. As the saying goes about the apple falling from the tree. But there was something different about Conrad. Where his father was just plain evil and dangerous, Conrad was just weak and disgusting. Without his father, he couldn't function. Perhaps that was why he was no longer in Colorado. The other man with Conrad was Peso Martin. Kitty peered around the corner of the entranceway and saw the lantern lights seemingly becoming smaller as the men traversed farther down the tunnel. The echo of their footsteps was becoming fainter. She motioned to the others to follow and stepped into the tunnel. Following Conrad and Peso seemed like a good bet as far as finding the prisoners. Kip placed his hands on her shoulders, halted her, and stepped in front of her, assuming command and the lead. He could see the faint smile of acquiescence and subservience on her face. She leaned close behind him, her left hand flat against the middle of his back. All three of them had their guns out and at the ready. They moved forward slowly, stealthily, as silently as they could. Only the sound of trickling water seeping through the ceiling above remained. Every other sound of movement seemed to be magnified in the confines of the underground. It was only a few moments before the lantern lights up ahead disappeared, leaving Kip, Kitty, and Jeremy in total darkness. They kept moving along steadily, keeping one arm out to feel the wall beside them with one hand. Eventually, the tunnel seemed to widen out, but actually it was merely branching out into 3 tunnels. It was totally black in all directions. Which way to go? They all stood motionless, listening, straining, trying to discern some clue as to which way to go. Then, faintly, they seemed to hear the sound of metal chinking on rock and the muted echo of human voice off to the left. They moved off into this corridor, trying to move a little faster, daring not to light a match, and trying not to make a sound that might announce their approach. "I'm beginning to wish they had hung us instead of this," Bud Geary complained, as he swung the pickaxe one more time into the tunnel wall. A hunk of rock cracked and fell at his feet. He had to step back to keep the falling debris from showering down on his bare shoulders. His shirt was off, and sweat and dirt caked his young, lithe body. He lowered the pickaxe, letting the head rest on the ground with the handle up. He removed one hand at a time and rubbed his sore blisters. "No one said you could rest, prisoner." One of the 2 guards who oversaw this part of the tunnel shouted. He snapped a whip with a warning crack, coming within inches of Bud, but not touching him. "Get back to work." Bud grimaced and got back to swinging the pickaxe. The other prisoners had kept working. They had been through these tirades many times before, and the outcomes had always been the same. Guards prevailed, and prisoners kept working. This part of the mine was well lit so the men could see to work. "Someone is going to wish they had hanged us," the young man named Francis said to himself, as he continued to pound large clumps of rock into small pieces. He hadn't seen a trace of silver since he'd been there. There were 8 prisoners working this part of the mine. 4 of them had already been there when Francis and his 3 friends had arrived the day before. He didn't know how long they had been there, but they all looked gaunt, worn out, and malnourished. From time to time, when he dared to catch a glimpse of his laboring friends, he could see that Pete Garvey and Garth Pearson were already wearing out. They had scarcely had anything to eat since they had been there, and hardly any sleep at all. If you could call a few minutes of respite on the hard mine floor sleep. There had been times when Francis had dreams of being a famous gunfighter like Billy the Kid. He had thought there was glory to be had in using a gun. But he had learned that he was not brave nor courageous, but a normal average person with fears and hopes like anyone else. He had hoped that he would never use a gun again, but now as he looked around at his friends and other unfortunates in this god-forsaken hellhole, he knew that if he were ever to survive this injustice, Frankie the Kid must be resurrected as a real person, not a cardboard, fake, caricature, hero. Fear and ego must be put aside and justice must be done. Did I hear someone say they'd prefer to hang? Bezo Martin said, grinning as he and Conrad stepped into the work area. Good, good, Conrad chimed in after him. I'm glad everyone is enjoying the work, he laughed gleefully. No one dared to stop working long enough to acknowledge the taunts. To the guards, Conrad said, listen up. I've got instructions for you. Kip, Kitty, and Jeremy had moved along the dark tunnel until they saw the light from the mine work area spilling out into the corridor. There was no sign of Conrad nor Peso, but they could hear them. They hurried and gathered close just outside the work area. The voices could be heard clear now. Conrad was saying, the wagon's just about ready to go. You know what to do. You take it to the same place as last month. Follow the same instructions. You got that. As soon as your relief men get here, we'll send them down and you can come on up and take the team. We'll see you then, Conrad concluded. Then to Martin. Let's go, Peso. Realizing the two men were about to go back into the tunnel, Kip, Kitty, and Jeremy turned and scampered away from the lighted area back into the darkened gloom of the tunnel. The only thing they could do was find a wide spot in the tunnel, spread out, and flatten themselves against the wall, hoping that as the two men passed by, they wouldn't be holding their lanterns high enough and in the right position to cast light on them. They each picked out a crevice to slide into. There, each one waited silently, careful not to breathe, careful not to make a sound. Moments dragged on. Finally, Conrad and Peso appeared in the tunnel corridor. They were both holding their lanterns low, as they had before, shining the light on the floor ahead of them, watching their steps. So far, so good. Closer and closer the two men advanced along the tunnel, their boots thudding against the tunnel floor, echoing loudly in the darkness. The lanterns swung back and forth with the swagger of each step. The beams of light bouncing against the base of the walls on each side of the corridor. The two men were in deep, animated conversation, obviously in a heated argument about something, as they approached the figures pressed so tightly against the tunnel walls. The echo of the cavern muted their words somewhat and could not be discerned, but it seemed to be something about Peso Martin being there to boss Conrad around, which the spoiled offspring of the great Simon Price did not like. Conrad and Peso passed by the hidden intruders without the slightest hint of their presence. They continued to argue all the way down the tunnel until they disappeared at the turnoff where they would continue on to exit the mine. After waiting a few minutes to make sure Conrad and Peso was gone, Kip and Kitty slipped off the wall like melting wax. Even in the darkness, they seemed to sense each other. They found one another and slid into each other's arms, embracing and breathing sighs of relief. Meanwhile, Jeremy had slithered off the opposite wall and joined them, though not quite so intimately. None of them could see any of the others, but each one knew each of the others was all right. Jeremy was sure Kitty and Kip were more than all right, but he wasn't quite sure he was all right with that part of the situation, though. What now? Jeremy whispered. Do what we came for, Kip said resolutely. Get those boys out of there. Kitty could feel his body separating from hers as he turned away. She turned with him, and Jeremy followed close behind. Almost as a single body, they moved off into the dark. Who are you? The larger of the two guards snapped, spinning around and taking his attention off the prisoners. He dropped his whip and snatched his pistol from its holster riding on his right hip. He waved it menacingly. The other guard had been slower on the uptake, but followed suit and went for his gun also. Hold it, Hold it, Kip Dalton said, holding his hands out in front of him, palms forward in a calming motion. We're your relief shift. The prisoners had stopped working at this intrusion. Frankie and his friends recognized Jeremy right off. They glanced from one to the other and went back to work along with the others when the guard ordered them. No one told you birds you could quit working, the guard shouted. This ain't none of your affair. Then to Kip and Jeremy he said, How come I never seen you before? We're new, Kip said. Came in with Peso Martin. He didn't tell us nothing about it, the guard grumbled. Since when did Peso Martin tell you anything? Kip answered. Well, you got that right, but Price didn't tell us neither. Since when does Peso tell Price anything? I guess you do know the score after all. You must be on the level. The guard said. Of course I am. You'd better get going. That wagon's waiting for you. The guard put his pistol away and turned to the other. He's right. We'd better get going. The other guard holstered his weapon, and as the two guards walked past the assumed relief shift to leave, Kip and Jeremy wheeled on their heels, drawing their pistols and swinging them in wide arcs to bring them down in crashing blows on the backs of the two guards' heads. Their hats caved in, crushed, and fell off. Blood trickled from their scalps and dripped down their necks. Kip and Jeremy quickly sheathed their weapons and dragged the two men farther into the mine and off to the side where they couldn't readily be seen by anyone entering the mine. By now, all work had ceased. Jeremy was just standing up from having dragged the men aside when his friends surrounded him. They were patting him on the back and reaching out to shake his hand. It was like a fight to see who could shake his hand first, and Jeremy was a bit overwhelmed. Through the dirt and the sweat and the tiredness in their faces, there were smiles of joy. Their friend had come to rescue them. Had Jeremy had time to think, he would have remembered that the last time he met up with these four boys, they weren't exactly his friends. To tell the truth, he really wasn't sure what they were. Whoa, 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 Jeremy said, pulling away from them and trying to settle them down. Settle down if you want to get out of here. Listen up. We have to move fast. There's two guards on their way here, and we've got to be ready. The boys stepped back and settled down. Who's he? Pete Garvey asked, indicating Kip. Kip Dalton. He's helping us. Kitty had just walked in. Every head turned in her direction. Kitty! They almost all exclaimed in surprised unison. Any other questions can wait until later. Right now we've got to get busy, Kitty said, dismissing their exuberance. Kip explained the plan and offered the other prisoners a chance to go with them. Two of the prisoners were old men and would be a liability to them if they went along. Still, he knew Kitty would not permit him to leave them behind. He had to offer. The two old men knew the score and declined. Kip was relieved, as were the others. The other two prisoners declined also. They were afraid of being killed escaping, or worse yet, being caught escaping and being thrown back into this hellhole. Even to herself, Kitty was glad that they only had to concern themselves with getting their own out. Besides, she had not considered the possibility of other prisoners and had not discussed that eventuality with Cyclone. He would be waiting on the rim of the basin to shoot at anyone he didn't know. It was just as well the other prisoners did not opt to go with them. Perhaps, someday, she could come back for them and free them. By the time the real relief guards arrived, the other two were still unconscious and had been tied hand and foot with whatever materials could be found. The new guards were taken quickly by surprise. They were gun-whipped, unconscious, and tied in the same fashion as the others. All of the guards were stripped of their gun belts and sidearms. Each of the boys strapped them on. They had never worn guns prepared to kill before, but this time would be different. They would be fighting for their lives. They would no longer be punk kids. Live or die, they would be men this time. Chapter 10. With each of them carrying lanterns, The tunnel was lit well enough that they could run at a fast pace for the full length of the corridors to the mine entrance. As they approached the exit, they could see the grayness of dawn outside. The rain had subsided substantially. Throwing caution to the wind, they all smashed their lanterns against the walls of the tunnel, extinguishing flames and bursting through the opening into the open area of the basin. They all had their guns out and at the ready. If there was anyone outside and about, they would be taken by surprise. They would not be given a chance to react or draw guns. They would be shot down on the spot while everyone continued to run and escape. Cyclone, Rap, and Chief would open fire from above, covering the escapees and driving any mine personnel scrambling for cover. Kip and Jeremy were the first to charge through the mine opening out into the open area. They moved out far enough to give room for the others to follow out behind them. They took up a stance at the ready with their guns out, each one facing in opposite directions to cover the entire area of the basin. 2 men had just emerged from the refinery and were just closing the door behind them. They came up short with a start as they saw the group of runners pouring out of the mine. At first, they were stunned with surprise. Then, as realization set in, they started to reach for their guns. Cyclone let loose with his rifle, and Lead crashed into the door jamb above the 2 men's heads, sending splinters into their faces. The thunder of the shot was still echoing in the basin. The 2 men did a hop, skip dance, stumbling over their feet, each one trying to beat the other one back to the door to duck back inside. They almost had their legs entwined. They had forgotten about drawing their pistols and had let them slide back down into their holsters. Rap and Chief had followed up with rifle fire also, and Cyclone loosed another round, tearing the woodwork around the door to pieces as the 2 men opened the door, practically fell inside, and slammed it shut. A half-dozen holes appeared in the top half of the door. The basin was now filled with the thunder of gunfire. The sudden barrage of gunfire had brought the entire camp to life. Doors were opening. Men were appearing and running out into the open. Kip, Jeremy, Kitty, Frankie, Pete, Bud, and Garth were running as fast as they could across the open area, their guns spewing flame and barking thunder as they ran. Fire from up on top of the basin rim shifted to the newcomers, covering the escapees with rapid fire. The mining men retreated as fast as they had responded to the initial attack. They ran for cover inside the buildings and hiding behind closed doors. A fusillade of lead continued to pound the doors and kept them pinned down. Outside, Kip and the others raced to the waiting, loaded freight wagon. Not only would this be a good conveyance to get them all out of the basin, but odds were good that the load was valuable and could be useful to the Wildcats. This was something not planned on, but the fortunes of war were always gratefully accepted. Kip released the ground hitch that had been attached to the team and tossed it aside, while Jeremy climbed onto the box and took up the reins. Kitty and the others jumped into the wagon bed on top of the load, while Kip clambered aboard next to Jeremy on the wagon seat. Cyclone and the others were still pouring lead into the basin, keeping anyone from daring to show themselves and try to stop the escapees. Jeremy whipped up the 4-up set of 2 teams and shouting, "Ee-yah!" The wagon jolted forward. Kitty bounced unsteadily and absently reached up to hold her hat on, although it was firmly tied with a chin strap. The wagon slewed sideways in the mud as Jeremy pushed them forward into the inclining trail that led up and out of the basin. Kitty regained her hold and settled herself. She pulled back the corner of the canvas. Even in the darkness of coming dawn, she could see that the wagon floor was covered with wooden cases, the kind used to ship silver or gold bullion in. In this case, it would have to be silver. The odd thing about these cases was that stamped in big, bold black letters, it said, Juarez, Mexico. The wagon fishtailed back and forth as the double team raced upward, pulling its heavy load of freight and passengers. They had just hit the first turn in the trail, That would level them out at less of a pitch as the trail began to wind more along the side of the basin, before it would once again turn and begin to turn into a higher incline for a while before plateauing off into another parallel stretch of road. As the horses ran into this second turn and needed to stretch into the incline, the burden of the weight they were carrying took its toll. Their hooves slid in the muddy trail, and they faltered trying to negotiate the turn. Jeremy stood in the box, lashing out with the whip that had been attached in the upright on the box, and repeatedly urged them on. Hia, hia! The wagon slid back a bit. Kitty and the other passengers had to slide into new positions to regain their balance and adjust their grips, which was difficult since they still had their guns out and ready to fire if pursuit came. So far, so good. Cyclone and the others were still keeping anyone from coming after them, but gunfire had erupted from inside the buildings. Windows had been smashed, and return fire was being wielded back at Cyclone and the others on the rim, as well as fire at the fleeing escapees. Their return fire was erratic and ineffective, however, as Cyclone, Rap, and Chief drove them back into cover. Their fire after the others had been futile since the wagon was already out of pistol range, and the miners didn't seem to have access to rifles. As the wagon managed to reach the top of the basin and disappear over the rim, Cyclone and the others began to let up on their firing. They only fired haphazardly and sporadically as they backed away from their cover, remaining half-bent and low as they retreated to their horses. They mounted up, gathered up the reins of Kitty's, Jeremy's, and Kip's horses, and rode off in a gallop, straight back in the direction they had come from. As the firing from outside died down, miners started to wonder if the attack was over. Peso Martin was in the office with Conrad Price. After a few moments of silence, Conrad said, "You think they've quit?" "I don't know," Peso said skeptically. "Maybe it's a trick." He sidled to the window and peered out from the side. He saw nothing moving out there. The freight wagon was gone, and so were the escapees. He gritted his teeth. He waited another minute. Still, nothing moved out there. Still no sound. Maybe the attackers were gone after all. He stepped to the door and pressed alongside of it. He opened it a crack, keeping both guns ready. Light from inside would be seen shining through the crack from outside if the assailants were still there. There was no response from outside. With the barrel of his right-hand gun, he pushed it through the crack and forced the door all the way open. Still no reaction. He waited a moment, then stepped into the doorway, both guns ready. Nothing. He stepped outside. Nothing. He took a few steps out into the open area. Nothing but silence and the last lingering drizzle of the early morning rain. The sun had just peeked up over the horizon. He strode about surveying the area. He finally decided the danger was past. The attackers were gone. But so were his prisoners, his wagon, and its load. "All right, come out of your holes, you lily-livered cowards," Peso shouted to the camp. "We gotta saddle up and get after that wagon. Let's go." Jeremy never slowed the teams once they were out of the basin. They would need to put as much distance between them and the mine as possible before a search party could be organized and sent out after them. Men on horses could travel much faster than a wagon laden with freight, and this was heavy freight even for a 4-up. The ground was still wet and soggy from the rain. The wheels had built up cakes of mud, and it oftentimes tended to bog down. They rolled steadily northward away from the barren landscape into broad, sprawling lowlands with greener, more lush countryside. Here, the wagon could roll along much smoother, free from the mud and dirt. The wheels would often slide in the wet grass, pushing the weight of the wagon against the teams, forcing them to move faster, as if trying to get out of its way. Jeremy would have to haul back on the brake, and the wagon would sluice sideways down embankments. Then the teams would have to strain to pull the rig back up the inclines. They had just reached bottom land and found a rutted trail running parallel to a river and given the horses a breather, when they caught sight of the riders behind them At first, they hoped it was Cyclone and the others catching up to them, but on second glance, they knew that was not the case. Once again, Jeremy stood up in the wagon box and whipped the teams into a run. The wagon jerked forward, and all passengers had to grab a new hold to regain balance. The horses stretched their strides to the fullest, and immediately they started to extend the distance between them and the approaching riders. The sudden burst of speed signaled the pursuers that they had been seen, and they prodded their mounts even faster forward, and the distance once again began to shorten. "Hia! Hia!" Jeremy shouted as he lashed again and again, urging more and more from the horses. Their great muscles flexed, and their hooves dug deep for footing as they pounded forward, stride after stride. But with each stride, momentum was being lost as the trail continually wound upward, higher and higher above the rolling river below. Closer and closer the riders behind were closing the gap. Higher and higher the trail rose, and more the horses were beginning to falter. Their bodies were covered with lather, and their breathing was labored. The pursuers had ridden into pistol range and opened fire. Lead pellets were now flying close to the wagon and its passengers. Shots thundered in a continuous volley. Kitty, Frankie, and his friends returned fire. Kip turned around on the driver's seat and blasted away with his weapon. The riders slowed a bit at the first round of return fire, but then at the urging of Peso, Martin spurred forward in renewed pursuit. The battle raged on, fleeing wagon and teams with pistoliers returning fire and oncoming riders filling the air with flying lead. Two of the pursuing riders took hits and spilled from their saddles, and Garth Pearson suffered a hit and fell onto the canvas-covered load. Up ahead, the trail was taking a sharp, twisting curve upward that would wind around a high rise. Jeremy hauled on the reins to pull the teams into the curve, but at the speed they were traveling, the teams panicked and half slid on their haunches as Jeremy tried to negotiate the turn. It was still wet and muddy here, and as the horses tried to regain their footing, they twisted themselves in the traces. The wagon tongue cracked, and the kingpin popped loose. The horses' hooves dug in, and they managed to run free, climbing up the rest of the incline, while the wagon completely separated and rolled backward down the trail. It had all happened so fast it was like a blur, and despite the oncoming riders and their blazing guns, all of them leaped instinctively from the wagon on the uphill side of the wagon, for the other side was a sheer drop to the river below. Bud Geary had wrapped an arm around Garth Pearson and taken him with him when he jumped. Jeremy was still clinging to the reins when the horses separated and flew through the air, landing in the trail behind them. He rolled from side to side as they dragged him up the incline. His whole body racked with pain from the impact, and the dragging was giving drag burns all over his body. But he hung on. The wagon, with its heavy load, just kept picking up speed as it rolled straight back until it went over the edge of the trail on the far side and went flying out into open air and tumbling downward into the river below, disappearing in a loud splash into its deep waters. By the time the others had caught up to Jeremy, he had halted the two teams. Garth had been able to walk on his own. Cyclone, Chief, and Rap were just catching up to them from up above. They wasted no time in mounting up. Frankie and his friends mounted the 4 horses that had been used as teams, and they all rode off just as Peso Martin and the others caught up to them. They seemed more concerned about the wagon and its load at the bottom of the river than in continuing pursuit. Chapter 11. The bullet had only grazed Garth's side and wasn't very deep. They had ridden for a half hour before finding a place to hide out. Garth hadn't lost much blood, for it had crusted over. It did, however, need cleaning out and bandaging. He would also need a new shirt. For that matter, all of the boys needed one, and among them, the Wildcats were able to outfit them with something that they could make do with. They had found themselves a good hiding spot in a grove of trees. So far, they had not seen any sign of Peso Martin or his men. "What do you think, Garth?" Kitty said. "Think you can ride?" "Sure, it was just a scratch. Nothing to keep me down. What do we do now?" "You boys can ride and get out of here now," Kitty said. "I suggest you get as far away as you can, where Simon Price can't ever find you again." "What are you gonna do? We've still got business with Price to take care of." "Well, so have we," Garth said. "Don't we, fellas?" "Darn right," Frankie said. "Besides, we owe you." He glanced from Kitty to Cyclone and the rest. "You boys don't owe us a darn thing but to keep yourselves out of trouble and stay alive," Cyclone said. "I kinda gotta admit that none of you is worth two hoots and a holler, but you got a way of having got under our skin a mite. So go on and get out of here." "You've saved our hides twice now," Frankie said. "And you made me see the error of my ways about that punk Frankie the Kid stuff, and I went back to being just plain Francis. But now I want to be Frankie the Kid for real, and for the first time. I want to do it right. I want Simon Price to know it too. If you'll let us, we want to ride with you a while. At least this one time, please." "You could all get killed," Kitty said. "We know that," Frankie said. "Don't we, guys?" The others all agreed. "Conrad and Peso must have hightailed it back to town to tell Simon what happened," Cyclone said. They were crouching in the tall weeds on a knoll high above the area where the wagon had gone off the trail into the river and peering out at the busy activity below. The two guards that had been in the mine supervising the prisoners and the two relief guards were there. The two younger prisoners were there, and 4 other men from the mine that the Wildcats did not recognize were there. They had brought another freight wagon, and obviously the crew had been there for quite some time, for the wagon bed was almost half covered with bullion crates. They were still dark with wetness. The 2 prisoners were in the water down below with 2 of the miners. They would dive under the water attaching ropes to crates, return to the surface, and signal the 2 miners up top on the edge of the trail, manning the ropes. One by one, the crates would be hauled up, disengaged from the ropes, and loaded into the wagon bed. The Wildcats watched for another hour and a half as the process continued. As the wagon bed approached 3/4 full, progress down below seemed to slow down, and the appearance of new crates became more intermittent and less frequent. The divers were more and more returning to the surface empty-handed, getting a fresh gulp of air and diving back under the water. The cases that did come up were not in as good of shape as the earlier ones. More and more they came up damaged. Some had broken panels, others had missing panels altogether. Sunlight reflected off the contents, revealing without a doubt that the crate did, in fact, contain silver bullion. Some crates came up, not only broken open, but partially empty. When after lengthy periods of searching, no further traces of the bullion were found in the river below, whether because they had sunk too deeply into the mud, or washed away, or for whatever reason, it became evident that the search for further retrieval was beyond practicality. The wagon load was now perhaps 85 to 90% of the original amount, and that would have to do. The search was called off, and prisoners were the first to be sent up. They swam to the ropes to start their ascent. While everyone was busy wrapping up the operation, the Wildcats went into action. Kitty, Kip, Jeremy, and the 4 young men slithered rapidly down the hill through the weeds and burst out onto the trail, guns ready and spreading out, next to the wagon and the 4 guards, who were just tying the canvas down over the load. The guards were bent over and taken with a startle. Their eyes lifted, staring into the bores of gun barrels. Their hands reflexively reached halfway toward the pistols on their hips, but they thought better of it and froze. Cyclone, Chief, and Rap had stood erect in plain sight on top of the knoll. They had rifles out and aimed menacingly. "Just everybody hold your hosses," Cyclone said. "Raise your hands and behave yourselves and nobody gets hurt. Yes, understand." The 2 men manning the ropes suddenly caught sight of what was happening and almost dropped the ropes, but Kitty ran toward them, wielding her pistol. Just keep doing what you're doing if you don't want to take a dive with a lead anchor in your gullets. Frankie ran over to back her up. The two men nodded their understanding. Fear was in their eyes, and their muscular arms trembled as they continued to haul on the ropes. A moment or two later, the first prisoner came over the edge and rolled onto his side. Frankie pulled him to his feet, and for the first time he saw Kitty. "What?" he started to say. "Never mind. Keep quiet," Kitty ordered in almost a whisper. "Get over there with my friends." She motioned with a nod of her head. With a quizzical look on his face, he moved quickly away, just as his companion rolled over the edge onto the rim. Frankie pulled him away, and they dismissed him summarily to the others with the same dispatch. "Keep them coming," Kitty ordered the two rope men. "No signs, no signals. They get one inkling, something is up, and you're all down. You got it?" They nodded, dropped the ropes back down, and the miners started. They climb up. "Frankie," Kitty said, "get Kip for me, will you?" "Sure thing." He skipped away. A few seconds later, Kip strode over. A big smile was on his face. "And what can I do for you, milady?" he said graciously, his eyes twinkling with delight. She glanced down the ropes toward the men climbing up. "You're so much better at this than I am." He grinned broadly. "Yes, indeedy, I certainly am." He hefted his pistol and stepped close to the edge, waiting for the two miners to roll over onto the top. When the Wildcats drove the loaded wagon away, all of the mine personnel were left tied securely with their own ropes. The two miners that had climbed up out of the water were still unconscious thanks to Kip's expertise. They turned the wagon around and headed back the way they had come, for a ways to avoid the sharp upward turn that had been so dangerous to them before. They took the two prisoners with them, and when they found a fairly flat stretch of meadow off to the right, they turned off and set out toward the eastern horizon. They traveled about an hour until the countryside became more hilly and covered with trees and rocks. They rolled onto hard rock country, where they would leave little sign of their passing, and found a small canyon with a narrow stream running through it. They pulled up inside it and found cover behind some scrub brush. It had been a long time since they had stopped to rest and eat, although they had periodically partaken of strips of dried jerky from time to time as they rode in the saddle. The water was clear and cool here. They refilled their canteens, and the horses drank their fill from the stream. There was fresh grass along the stream banks for the horses to crop. As tempting as it was to build a small smokeless fire and boil some coffee, it was decided that it would not be a good idea. Even keeping the smoke at a minimum, they did not want to take a chance on exposure. Besides, they did not want to linger in the area any longer than necessary, and it would take time to get the water boiling. They broke out some cans of peaches and some stale biscuits from the saddlebags, and all partook of a meager meal. They all sat on the ground near the wagon. While the others washed it all down with water, Rap stood up, pulled his flask from his coat pocket, threw his shaggy head back, and chuck-a-lugged several swallows. "Damn, that's good," Rap said with relish as he pulled it from his lips. "That is heaven." He fluttered his eyes and shook his head. "That is pure D heaven." "You mean pure D devil, paleface," Chief chided. "It's not heaven you headed for." "Look you, fake Injun, you go where you want. Happy hunting ground, is it? I go happy drinking ground." He took another swallow. Then, lowering the flask and carrying it in his massive hand as he strode around the wagon, eyeing it appreciatively. He stepped up to it and tossed the front corner flap of the canvas back, exposing the loose ingots. "Wee-wee!" he exclaimed like an excited little boy on Christmas morning. "Would you just look at that? We're rich fellas. Richer than rich," he said. He quickly stoppered his flask and stuffed it into his coat pocket. He picked up an ingot and turned it over in his big hands. He began to dance a jig and giggled with glee. "Lookum like firewater no good for paleface either," Chief said. "Him dance like crazy Injun." "Crazy dad burned idiot," Cyclone groaned with disgust at the antics. Hey, Cy, Rap shouted, holding the brick up. How much you think all this is worth? 300,000? From where he was sitting, Jeremy thought he noticed something. A darkness crossed his face, and he pushed himself to his feet and hurried to the wagon and took the brick from Rap. He turned it over in his hands and examined it carefully. Without saying anything, he placed the brick back in the wagon bed and picked up another one. He didn't take it completely out of the wagon. He turned it over and examined it. He put this one down, picked up another one, looked at it, and tossed it back into the wagon box angrily. His jaw was set and was fixed on the load. He remained silent. By now, the others were realizing that something was wrong. What is it, boy? Cyclone asked. Kitty jumped to her feet and ran to the wagon. The others came to their feet and followed close behind. Chief was more nimble than Cyclone and had gotten to his feet and joined the others long before Cy had managed to climb to his feet and shuffle over to join them. He was too far behind the crowd to see just what was going on. Take a look, Jeremy said, handing a brick to Kitty. Chief pushed by the others and took another one from the wagon bed. He held it up close to his inch-thick lenses. The silver is peeling off, Kitty said. It's just a thin layer of silver painted over a lead brick, Chief said. So how much is it worth? Rap was still smiling with delight. 4,000, Chief said. Each brick? No, you darn fool, the whole load. Aw, you're just funning me, you darn fake engine, Rap said. His smile was starting to fade while still trying not to believe it. The water must have gotten to it and made it peel, Frankie said. I read about it in school. It's called silver plating when you put a thin veneer of silver over something to make it look solid. They make cheap jewelry that looks real, but it can corrode or peel off under certain circumstances. The exposure in the water must have affected it when the cases broke open. Do you think all of the cases are lead bricks covered like this? Probably, Kitty said. It's unlikely that just the broken cases had the coated bricks. But what I can't figure out is why Simon Price would go to all this trouble to coat bricks with silver, and why he would go to so much trouble to get this shipment back when it's worth so little. He was probably intending to palm this stuff off to someone as real silver, Jeremy said. But surely, whoever bought it would find it out soon enough and come back at Price right away. There's got to be more to it, Kitty said. He's got something up his sleeve, if we only knew what it is. Sounds to me like this Simon Price is even slicker than what I thought, Kip Dalton put in. You couldn't imagine, Kitty said. He can think up the gold-dangdest schemes nobody ever heard of afore, Cyclone said. He's got the devil hisself whispering in his ear, telling him what to do next. God-fearing people like us ain't got a chance of guessing what he could be up to. Maybe we need a little less God-fearing and a little more devil-daring, Kip said. There was a glint in his eye and a glimmer of hope. After leaving the canyon, they returned to green meadows and tree-lined valleys. They rode for about half an hour when Cyclone rode alongside Jeremy and motioned to him to pull the teams to a halt. Jeremy pulled up. Cyclone shifted in his saddle and said to the two prisoners, Now you boys know we can't keep toting you around. I'm sorry about that, but that's just the way it is. It's not good for you, and it's not good for us. You hang with us and you're liable to wind up dead or back where you come from. Now we got you out here a ways from where you were. There's cover around here for you to hide in if you have to. We'll leave you a canteen, some jerky, and some canned peaches. That's all we got. Sorry we ain't got horses to give you, so you'll have to hoof it wherever you're going. But take my advice and get as far away from here as fast as you can and don't never come back. We appreciate the help and the advice, the one prisoner said as he jumped down from the wagon. Yeah, thanks again, the other said as he jumped down. They stood there with solemn looks on their faces as the wagon and riders moved on northward, leaving them behind.